Get started. Great. Christina just started recording the meeting for us. So yeah, thank you all for being here again. This is our 7th meeting as a Housing Production Strategy Task Force. So we're hoping to, in terms of the purpose of our meeting today, is to continue our discussion from the last meeting, which was just 2 weeks ago, meeting number 6, on sort of our recommended or initial recommendations in the initial housing production strategy recommendations memo, basically to come up with at least the task force's recommendations to have city council and planning commission consider at a future meeting, and that would sort of help us inform the draft document that will be posted later this spring, early summer. So yeah, with that, I guess I'll open it up. Are there any announcements that folks have for the group or anything that folks wanted to share before we get into the meat of the discussion here? I guess I should mention that we aren't going to be adopting the minutes from meeting number 6 at this meeting because we're just going to adopt them, meeting number 6 and 7 together at our next meeting. So we don't have that business to take care of. Sarah, is there anything that you wanted to say before we get started on the discussion?
Oh, I'm sorry, I missed the last meeting. Happy to be here to kind of see what strategies are being proposed.
Great. Well, I guess with that, I'll hand it over to Kate to get started on our on the presentation here. And we are going to cover just generally a recap of what we discussed last week, which is our recommended strategies, but spending the bulk of our time today talking about the category of strategies needing further discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Eric, and hello, good afternoon, everyone. So yeah, Eric already covered the agenda, so I'm just going to jump into the recap from the last meeting. So I'm not going to go through these in detail. We talked through many of these strategies at the last meeting, and just to remind folks, these are sort of the recommended strategies from staff and us as consultants. And we wanted to get your so this is the first slide. Here's 2 slides. And these are organized by near term, medium term, and long term. And that refers to sort of the implementation within the roughly 8-year time period before the city will have to go through this process again and have an updated housing production strategy. So these are the strategies that we've been considering that we think can be forwarded on to the Planning Commission and City Council as a recommended set of strategies. And we wanted to get your feedback on those and see if you agree with these recommendations. And so just to give a little bit of a recap from the last meeting, generally we heard support, or at least we didn't hear any opposition to any of these strategies that we talked about. So it seems like we're kind of generally on the right track. We did hear some comments for some potential changes to how we either prioritize or discuss some of these strategies, including potentially moving the pre-approved plan sets for ADU strategy, which is currently in the longer term implementation kind of bucket, into either medium term or maybe even near term, potentially if there are existing ADU plan sets out there that the city could potentially kind of incorporate or adopt as part of that program. So I think that's a change that we'll probably make unless we hear any other concerns about that. And then also we heard the potential to move the tax increment financing strategy to support affordable housing, potentially moving that into the near-term implementation, because that's something that the City Council has been discussing, in particular, a new TIF district or urban renewal area within the Foothills neighborhood. So that would potentially kind of move that up, and the city could start working on implementation in the nearer term over the next couple of years. Related to the public-private partnerships strategy, there was a comment to just kind of add to that the city could also take advantage of regional funding sources to support affordable housing. And this is something that the city is already doing and using the Metro Housing Bond to support some of the developments that are currently underway in the city, but just kind of recognizing that that is an important component of the public-private partnership approach. There was a comment asking us to to take a look at how the tax abatement strategies might impact the city's tax revenues. So the potential for lost tax revenues if the city were to consider some tax abatements to support different housing types. We were not able to do that, before this meeting. But if it's something that folks think is important, we could maybe consider including that in, the documents that we include with the final housing production strategy. And then we heard some comments from DLCD staff just suggesting some clarifications on how we're kind of framing those near-term, medium-term, and longer-term timeframes. And they also shared that they would be providing some more specific comments on the recommendations memo, I think, after we've gone through this process. So we can incorporate any of their comments into the final HPS documents. So I think at this point, we just wanted to see if, based on the recommendation, the initial set of recommended strategies, if there are any other comments, or if you all think these are kind of good to go to kind of forward on to the Planning Commission and City Council. Looks like Casey, you have a hand up.
Hi there. I just had a clarification question. If you could skip to the slide that covers parking. I know, Eric, we talked about last time. I know this is coming down. This is a state kind of mandate coming in here, but I was curious. It says remove or reduce, and I was curious which of those is mandated versus which of those is optional. So are we recommending to reduce parking requirements or eliminate them altogether? And if we're not required to eliminate them altogether, then I'm not sure that I would recommend that. That's not one that I would recommend. So I just was curious for some clarification on that one, because it says both options there.
Yeah, so that's a good question. We are currently, undertaking that work, so we don't have a clear sense of exactly which option we're going to be going forward with. But for the most part, all of them would also entail the removal of certain parking requirements, and at minimum, either a reduction or the complete removal of parking requirements. There's sort of different shades of gray in there, but under any circumstance, and we already have removed parking requirements in a certain portion of the town, I don't think we would be necessarily coming forth and saying the task force recommends a specific option for CFEC compliance. That work is kind of happening on a parallel timeline, but we are going to be forced to do some version of this. So I think that's kind of the idea, is to take some credit for the fact that will have a positive impact on housing production in the city.
Right, but just again to clarify, in terms of the recommendation that this group would be making, would we be in effect recommending that we eliminate parking requirements, or are we saying that we're going to in some way play around with parking requirements, or have to? Because I just want to draw a line there, because again, if we're coming down to what we're recommending, just want to be clear, recommending that we're eliminating parking requirements.
I mean, that is the recommendation the city is likely to come to, but I don't think that, as I was trying to say before, I don't think that's necessarily what the strategy is getting at necessarily. It's just saying some shade of removal or reducing minimum parking requirements via CFEC to comply with CFEC. There are different options we could take with that. Any of them would involve the removal of some parking requirements. Some of them would be reduced under certain options, or certain options could eliminate them in certain cases. So there's a lot of shades of gray here. I guess the simplest answer is we are not saying that the task force is recommending to eliminate all parking requirements, unless that's something that you are trying to tell us. This is a little bit more general of a strategy, I would say, to reach compliance with CFEC.
Got it. Okay. I'm just curious then, would it not make more sense to then have as this strategy to get us in line with the state policy, as opposed to kind of leaving the strategy so vague? Or are you saying at this point we just don't have enough detail to actually kind of call out with any clarity?
I mean, we can say that, we can word it differently. I think we probably worded it like this because this is how it's worded in the set of recommendations from the state. So we're kind of, I think in some ways, trying to play with their language, but Kate and Matt, can you let me know if there's more to it here?
I'll just add really quickly. There is more detailed language in the strategies document. This is just sort of our shorthand for what the strategy very generally says. And so I'm going to do my best to say what I think the document says, and then Kate's going to correct me if I'm off base. But the document basically says where we are required to eliminate them per state law, that's what we would do.
Okay.
In other parts of the city, the city could also explore reductions, and ultimately, it'd be up to city council to decide to remove or reduce in any of those other areas. And that's pretty much what the document says. The city will continue to look at this. It also just notes that parking is a significant portion of the cost of a lot of development. So at least at a minimum, reducing in certain areas is going to have a reduced cost, or will reduce the cost of development to a degree. But it doesn't say, that we're recommending eliminating them across the board or something like that. Does that help?
That's great. That's exactly what I was curious. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, we have a separate project to talk about those sort of details, but we don't necessarily think that it's a good use of this task force's time. I suppose it's probably the best way to say it. John.
Yes, it seems to me what we're really trying to do is develop a list of recommendations of things the city council might look at as potential avenues to create more affordable housing. We're not really saying we've looked at this really hard, this parking issue, for instance, and we recommend a specific thing that you do relative to parking. Only that parking might be something as a part of a full mix of a program that might lead to the extension of more affordable housing. Am I right about that, Erik?
That's exactly right, John. Thanks for clarifying that. I think, there are some specifics when it comes to, obviously we are proposing these to city council as recommendations, but in terms of what ends up in the HPS, there are some specifics in terms of timelines that we have to commit to, and some other, there are specific commitments involved. However, there's a lot of scope and sort of the details of the project are very much not being presumed within the housing production strategy. So if you look at the code audit and amendments strategy, that's another really good example that we're just not going to know exactly where that's going to land until we go through the larger process of outreach and sort of discussing more specifically those ideas with the community. And that's kind of what we're teeing up with this HPS work, is kind of what the city will dedicate its time to in the next 8 years.
So, for instance, Erik, the CTE tax that's we've got lots of information about is not this. We might say, yes, this should be part of our strategy to look at that as one option relative to housing, but we're not really saying you should actually do that, right?
No, I guess that's the one thing I would say we are saying this is what we recommend that the city commit to, right? So this is so that's our recommendation. City council could of course choose differently, or planning commission could recommend differently, but these are our recommendations of the discrete set of strategies that we will have to commit to, right? So I don't think if it ends up in the HPS, there's no longer an option as to whether or not we would be undertaking that strategy. If that is that clear? The details of the strategy are yet to be defined, but we would still have to commit to undergoing that process as a city.
And it doesn't.
So recommending a CTE tax is something that we would be doing that go to the city council, that they would then look at as one option, and you would have very specifics relative to that.
That's right.
Okay, yep. Thank you.
Yeah, that's
true. And I'm just going to add briefly, on that one in particular, that doesn't mean that the city is held to absolutely adopting a CET. You could get along at some point and say, gosh, we did a lot of study of this. We looked at it in more detail, and for these reasons, we were not able to implement this, or we determined we wouldn't. GLCD is going to kind of look hard at those kind of decisions, but you are not absolutely on the hook to go all the way to implementation on everything here, I would say. And we'll talk about CET a little later, so I don't want to go too far down the road on that one, but yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to depend on anything that's subject to voter approval. So that's one thing that we have very little control over. I mean, we can still recommend it, but we can't guarantee it. John.
Yeah, I want to go back to the parking thing. I'm still not quite sure about this because I'm not sure as a member that I would recommend that they even consider removing parking requirements. And so if what we're doing is just saying, yeah, these are things we should consider, I'm not sure that I agree with that on the removing part.
So again, just to clarify, this is something that the city has to do to a certain extent anyway. I mean, we can clarify more about what we think as a task force the city should do, but I think we are just kind of including that because it's kind of a separate project that's happening. It's a compliance effort with the state's rules. We are talking about that. It does kind of, there's a lot to unpack there. So similar to these other projects, we are kind of talking about that, within its own, on its own, not just as within the realm of the HPS. So that, there's a lot of background there that I think could be helpful, but ultimately, if that's not something that we want to recommend as this, that the folks here are uncomfortable recommending, that's something that, I don't think we're required to. We are just hoping to, include it here since it will improve our outcomes when it comes to housing production, because we are required to comply with that.
Yeah, I guess I'm kind of worried that I'll see in the review in 3 or 4 weeks or a month or two that the task force supports, they make a decision to remove parking for some kind of a new development, and I'm not sure that I'd want to read in the paper that the city used that and putting in some new housing someplace, because as I talk in the community about this thing, this is a hot item for people in the neighborhoods.
Yeah, I concur with John here. I think, Eric, I guess maybe the ultimate question that I have on this one is it worth making a clear distinction if we want to include this item, that there is a degree to which we have to get in line with state mandates on this particular item? I guess the ultimate question is, what, if anything, are we recommending above and beyond what we're already mandated to get in line with? That's my question. Do we want to include this as being above and beyond anything?
Eric, can I jump in here? I know there's lots of good, and we had this at the last meeting too. I mean, a lot of specific honing in on the parking. You guys are a great, well-rounded group of folks that we put on to focus on housing. And I'll just say, from the council perspective, we've been having lots of study of the parking issue in particular at the council level. Many of these other items the council hasn't touched at all. So as a task force, I think your time would be really, really well spent focusing and providing input to the council on pretty much all the other items, literally of all of these. The one thing the council has talked extensively about is the parking issue. And like Erik alluded to, it's more complex than we could cover in a task force on housing production. And that's why the Planning Commission and the council are spending a lot of time. So don't feel like you need to shoulder the weight of this big policy, because this isn't the parking task force, right? And feel good knowing that the council and the Planning Commission, they're getting lots of other community input on this. And I think we'd really appreciate your input much more so on the other items.
Bill?
Did I hear my name called?
Yeah, you have your hand raised.
Yes, okay, I just heard a little blurb there. Just kind of overlapping that into the filters of overview, if you will, is the environmental, so we don't build buildings that become obsolete, functionally obsolete in 5 years, and add to the costs. And so with that filter in mind, we look at everything that way and plan accordingly and maybe get grants accordingly to help lift the shoulder of finances. Plus, just as in regards to parking and ADUs being built and maybe over the garage, a unit being added, parking will be a separate consideration in those unique situations. And I'm sure that that's part of what Joe was talking about, is that there's unique situations beyond big developments that have to be shouldered. Springfield, 5 years ago, had something in place as they were adding middle housing that could be looked into. I do not have that information in front of me, but I just wanted to add the lens of environmental impact over everything so it doesn't cost us down the road. That's all I had to bring to the table. Thank you.
Looks like Rosalie also has a hand up. Go ahead, Rosalie.
Thanks. I thought I heard the word voter in regard to the ZET tax. Is that something that can't be implemented without a vote of the people?
Actually, and we will talk about CET shortly, but that actually does not require voter approval. I think the GO bond, the general obligation bonds, that's another strategy that we considered earlier, that would require voter approval. Okay. But CET would just need to be adopted by City Council.
And we will talk about CET in a lot more detail when we get to that portion of the presentation. Absolutely. But yeah, I think I just want to make sure we're really thinking about these strategies. And what I think what we're hearing is that we need, there might be more discussion required before the task force would be comfortable recommending the parking related strategy here. And I guess, I think I don't want to dwell on this strategy, but I don't want to include it here if there is not support from the task force. But again, I do want to point out that we are required to do this. So again, we are wanting to take some credit for this in some way for our housing work. So I think the strategy as it's written in the document, Casey, you had wondered, is there a reference to this being mandated by the state? And there absolutely is within the document. So I think we can go further within how that's written, or if you have any specific sort of suggestions on how we frame that strategy that would sort of assuage your concerns here. But we don't want to include something that folks are uncomfortable including in the recommendations.
No, I agree. I don't want to dwell on this beyond what we have to. Like Joe said, I think the only thing I might recommend is, do we want to just tweak the language in terms of what we're recommending to just say that we get in line with whatever these mandates are. Like, that's our recommendation, is that we get in line with those. I think if a city council is already exploring potential ways to go above and beyond, then it sounds like they don't need our recommendation, frankly, to do that. So I'm just wondering maybe if that covers what you're after.
Well, again, I think it's a lot more complicated than saying above and beyond. We have different options, and it's a lot more complicated than just removal or reduction of parking requirements. There's a lot more at play there. Okay. So there's a lot of other sort of costs, price parking, unbundled parking, sort of the city setting prices of parking, sure. Costs going on to businesses. So there's a lot of things that sort of are involved with that decision making. So it's not quite as simple as one or the other, remove or reduce.
Got it.
So anyway, any other comments on the overall strategies? Again, we're looking at the near term. There's also the medium and longer term strategies as well. And Rosalie, do you have any other comments for us, or is your hand just still raised from your question from before? John Turchi.
Yes, one of the sort of midterm strategies had to do with the tax increment financing of the a new Laura district down in the foothills area. Has that been moved up now?
So I'll respond. So we haven't made any changes based on the comments we heard at the last meeting because we knew this was kind of a continued discussion from the last meeting. So
Okay.
we haven't made those changes yet. They're not reflected in this presentation. But I think, I mean, unless staff disagrees, I think we could move that up to the near term strategies.
I would recommend that.
Yeah, I think generally speaking, if it's covered in that recap slide that Kate went over, then we are planning to do that unless folks have, other thoughts on this or have, been thinking about it further in the last couple of weeks and have anything to add. All right. We will be able to revisit this, I think, at the end of the discussion too, right, Kate? So if there is something that folks want to touch base on before we end the conversation, we still will have a little bit of time, hopefully.
All right, great. Well, yeah, we have lots left to talk about. So let's move on to the strategies needing further discussion. So these, again, are strategies that didn't have as clear support from this task force or from the Planning Commission or City Council, but they're still, they are strategies that could be impactful in, producing more housing in Lake Oswego. So we wanted to at least keep discussing these and see where you all are feeling or how you all are feeling about them. And at our last meeting, we went through, we had a slide summarizing each of these strategies, which I won't go through again, but we do have those slides still in the slide deck if you want to jump back to any of that more detailed information. But just for the sake of discussion, these are the 5 strategies still under consideration here. So zoning incentives for affordable housing, construction excise tax, the vertical housing development zone tax abatement, multiple unit property tax exemption, another tax abatement program, and then pre-approved plan sets for middle housing types. So I think for each strategy, it would be good to spend maybe 15 to 20 minutes talking about each one and just see, given all of the housing needs that have been identified in the HNA and given the recommended strategies that we've already included for potential inclusion in the HPS, do you think that these additional strategies should be considered or should be added because they're effective? Do you think they might be effective strategies to meet the needs? And, do you have any questions? Do you need any other information? And then specifically related to the construction excise tax, which is really the only specific funding, like new funding source under consideration. I mean, tax increment financing is definitely a funding source that would be part of the recommended strategies. But CET is the only kind of new revenue stream that is being considered. So if that's not included, because we have heard mixed opinions on that, do you think that the overall housing production strategy would be as effective as it needs to be without a funding source such as CET? So those are the questions, and then maybe we'll jump back to this slide and just talk through each one and see, maybe just starting with tests for strategy 2.1, the zoning incentives for affordable housing.
And Kate, I'm sorry to interrupt,
yeah.
but I might suggest 10 to 15 minutes on each one. 20 minutes would take kind of all of our remaining time, maybe plus some. So just to give us a little time at the end recap. And it doesn't have to be exactly that much, but if you're sort of thinking about generally, I would shoot for 10 to 15 per strategy so we can cover some other things too. So,
okay.
Sorry about that.
No, Matt's our taskmaster. All right, any comments on zoning incentives? Or does anyone feel comfortable saying, giving a yes, no at this point? Sarah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, for me, this is kind of an important one and maybe could be kind of tied into, I think it's 1.1 that's kind of looking at the code. I guess one of the questions I would have for maybe staff like Eric, with the existing kind of affordable projects that, there's quite a few of them in the works in the city right now. in terms of entitling those, did those developers need to utilize kind of the SB8, and like, are there any concessions or incentives that were offered to those or that were needed in order to build those? And or did they have to modify their designs because they were struggling to, stay under, some of, whether that's setbacks, height, any of the standards?
I will say, I don't know that it's whether or not they quote unquote needed it or not. I can't speak to like, I think there's other factors that are coming into play in terms of like the public conversations and going out to the community and sort of trying to, come to a development that folks would be in support of, or, that there's other factors that might have contributed to the way they designed it. But we haven't had folks utilize SB8 so far within the city. And I think we could do better at making that obvious that that's available, most likely. I think there's more that the city could do, and it's kind of making that clear that that's available to developers. But yeah, we haven't seen that being utilized for any of those developments yet.
Okay, maybe this is a question kind of for all the kind of consultant team and the city. Like, I apologize that I'm not as familiar with Oregon density bonus pieces, but it looks like SB8 predominantly focuses on density and height. Is that right? Does it include any other?
There's no other bonuses. So for folks that are not familiar with Senate Bill 8, this is something that passed a couple of years ago, and it requires cities to approve certain applications for affordable housing if they meet certain criteria, and it kind of automatically allows density and height bonuses. That's, again, the city is required to do that, and it applies to new developments that are proposed by nonprofit organizations in addition to public agencies and religious nonprofits. So that kind of takes care of the potential density or height bonus issue, unless the city wanted to go kind of above and beyond those state requirements. So I think this would either, again, be going above and beyond, or maybe considering other types of bonuses like a reduced open space, or again, parking. Cities can't require more than a certain amount of parking, or maybe no parking for affordable housing developments at this point. So yeah, this would really be considering, other types of bonus provisions for affordable housing.
Okay.
And I would just say, Sarah, I agree that this could be related to the other strategy that's looking at a code audit and update. And I'm pretty sure that right now the city doesn't have these SB8 provisions incorporated into its code. So, and that's true with a lot of cities across the state. They basically just kind of apply the state requirements directly, and they are pretty specific, the state requirements, in terms of what kinds of projects qualify, and then what level of bonus you're required to allow. So, part of that code update and audit process could include incorporating these into the city's code and looking at them in a little more detail. Do you want to do something more or a little different than that, and still meet the state requirements? So I think that's a really good question about that.
Yeah, just having submitted a lot of applications for affordable housing, parking density, height, and then open space. And it looks like open space is already somewhat addressed in that program 1.1. So, but yeah, I think if we can maybe at least kind of add maybe something about SB8 and kind of the city identifying, at least kind of incorporating into the code, kind of acknowledging those SB8 provisions into the code, I think that would be a way to maybe kind of merge these two efforts. Again, in California, they allow you the concessions that allow you some flexibility, up to a certain number of concessions. I know it doesn't sound like that clearly isn't required for Oregon. It would just be something the city could do if they wanted to go above and beyond in terms of allowing for more flexibility, like a slightly smaller setback, for example, that normally would require a variance, but now could be, processed as a concession type thing. So.
Yeah, just to speak briefly on that, Sarah, there actually is something, my understanding that there's short session at the state legislature like now, and it could be being passed like this week. Basically something similar to what you're describing in terms of variances. There's some implications for how we'll be, I think they're calling them adjustments, but there's some implications for how they would be, implemented in Lake Oswego, and it's something that we'll have to start talking about pretty soon once we know what is actually adopted. But that doesn't mean that there isn't more that we could look at when it comes to specific to affordable housing, because I don't believe that any of the state adjustments necessarily require affordability. So there might be anyway, there might be a lot more that we can do for affordable housing, and I think it's definitely a good idea to look beyond just height and density, particularly things like lot coverage in certain areas can be really restrictive. I've found. So there's a lot of things to look at.
I think just looking at things that may be considered a constraint to the development of particularly multifamily higher density development in the city, and addressing those through possible zoning, updates. I think that would be my recommendation. But yeah, otherwise, if you're going to have to implement what the state requires anyway. So
yeah, I guess this is kind of the code audit, looking at different barriers to housing, but maybe specifically if there's more that we can do to incentivize affordable housing in particular. But it is very similar type of conversation. So yeah, that's good input. I'm glad that we were able to clarify that there is this like existing state bonus for height and density that we could also do something as a city to incorporate more formally into our code as well. Anything else on zoning incentives, or any questions about zoning incentives, any clarifications about the concept or strategy? All right, well, I think it's been about 10 minutes at least, Kate. We might be able to move on.
All right. Okay, well, so the next one is construction excise tax. I imagine this one might spur quite a bit of discussion. So, and I think one thing we wanted to highlight with this strategy in particular is that there's that set of what we called contingent strategies in the initial recommendations memo. And those are things that would really depend on adoption of a funding source, such as CET, if the city were to kind of meaningfully participate in those strategies. And we have those listed on this slide. So Housing Trust Fund is really just a way of kind of consolidating and allocating funds that would have to come from a revenue source like CET. Low interest loans and revolving loan fund, that's something that the city wouldn't really be able to offer without a new revenue source. Community land trusts. The city could partner with the community land trust as part of a public-private partnership, but to provide any kind of financial assistance or donate land or things like that would really need funding to do that. And then preserving existing low-cost rental housing. Again, the city doesn't really have funds to participate in that, other than maybe starting with an inventory of those properties, which is one of the strategies we included in the recommended strategies. So just kind of keep those in mind if you think that these are important things that the city might want to be doing. Think about that and how that factors into your discussion and thoughts about CET. And then again, we have all the slides that we showed at the last meeting if you want to look at any of the details about construction excise tax. Anybody want to jump in? Sarah, go ahead.
I just had a question. Sorry. Do you want the memo was really fascinating. So were you planning to go over the memo more, or is it okay to just talk about it?
Yeah. So we did that at the last meeting.
You did. Okay. Sorry. Yeah, I apologize. I wasn't here. Okay. I think one of the questions I had about that was just kind of I noticed, it actually looks like the city can generate a fair amount of revenue from doing, from implementing this. I think my one question again, it always makes me a little nervous when I see kind of a half of it going towards housing and then the other half kind of in more general undetermined area. So again, since I wasn't here, I just was curious to know more about kind of what the thought process was behind the distribution of funding.
Yeah, so it might actually be helpful to jump to that slide just so we're all on the same page about that. So in terms of how CET funds are spent, residential, if you're charging a tax on residential development, all those funds need to go to housing in some form, affordable housing in some form. But then if you charge in commercial or industrial CET, half of those funds would need to go towards housing programs, not necessarily affordable housing, but I mean, all of the cities that we looked at that are implementing CET do contribute those funds to affordable housing. The remaining 50% of those commercial industrial CET funds, they're unrestricted, but again, I would imagine that the city would be interested in maybe contributing those to housing as well, but it does at least provide some flexibility to use those funds to support whatever priorities have been identified.
Does the city, so the city has the ability, the kind of the minimum that has to be put in is 50, but the city could decide to have it. Okay, that answers that.
Does this affect the overall city, the city income, the amount of taxes and money?
Sorry, John, I'm having a hard time hearing you. I don't know if anybody else is, but I don't know if you're able to speak up or come closer to the mic or something.
I was saying, if you add all of these incentives, how does that affect the overall city budget, or how would it affect the overall city budget?
So this would be a tax on construction. So the developer that's proposing a new either housing or non-residential development would contribute, a small percentage of that, the value of that project would pay that into this, would pay that as a tax to the city, and that would go into kind of a pool of funding that the city would have a plan for allocating. Obviously, most of that would need to go towards housing programs or development. So it wouldn't really impact the city's budget unless it were to have like a really drastic impact on development that was proposed and have a real cooling effect on development. And Brendan Buckley, who's our, economic expert, can feel free to chime in. But from what we have heard, CET has not had that effect in cities that have adopted it. Brendan, I don't know if you've heard anything different than that.
I haven't. It's people get a little concerned because it has an added cost to it, but generally in cities where development is already fairly robust and feasible, that it hasn't been found to have a really strong detrimental effect. So it hasn't. I'm trying to think of there's some examples in the memo, but generally, those communities that already have strong development momentum keep that momentum is what it seems, and start to build up these funds.
Yeah, I think probably the more general concern about a CET is that it could disincent some types of development. So that's why there are some exceptions for just that are required by the state. So the state would require us to exempt affordable housing, public buildings, hospitals, and certain other types of facilities from the CET. So I think it's good to think about if there's anything that you think should be exempted, that maybe the city maybe if you have concerns that this could cool development, maybe if we did exempted certain types of development, that would assuage those concerns. Casey.
You just beat me to it. I think look, if I was going to raise concerns about this one, I keep coming back to something that Joe said at our last session, which was, ultimately, I think we're trying to encourage a spectrum of opportunities here in Lake Oswego. And, in my mind, I guess at the existential level, I would think that we want to focus on whatever policy that kind of removes barriers from folks trying to develop in different areas across that spectrum, but doesn't necessarily harm others, or make it more difficult for others. And this one, I think what jumps out to me as not everyone in Lake Oswego is, doing multi-million dollar development, and cost right now for construction for single families, everything from, materials to contractors to interest rates. Like it's tough times out there for especially folks who are looking to maybe build in Lake Oswego for homes that are, they wouldn't qualify for affordable housing, but they're in a range of like 400K to 600K, somewhere like that. And any kind of development is meaningfully impacted by additional tax levies at this time in particular. So I guess my question for staff and, ultimately for the consultants is, given the broader market environment, and given Joe's priority for us just basically trying to serve a spectrum here, does it make sense to target goals which will make it harder for folks who don't fall into this category to live and develop in Lake Oswego? I think that would be what I'd call out.
Well, just a really quick response from me. I think, you certainly could exempt not just, the housing that's affordable in terms of the thresholds that are identified in the by the state. You could further exempt maybe what you might think of as workforce housing. So housing that would be affordable to people at, below 120% median family income in Lake Oswego, something like that. If, the concern was, hey, let's make sure, and that would probably cover homes in the price range you just mentioned, Casey. So that might be another way to think about it. And so that you're not producing barriers to building housing that's affordable to folks in that range. So that I would just toss that out there as something you could do. You've got a fair bit of leeway on how you adopt a CET if it's something the city pursues. And I mean, you could also just not apply it to residential. You could just apply it to commercial or industrial. So there's a lot of different ways to pursue this. And and you can kind of see how some other cities have applied it in other places. So anyway, that's my thought, or one of my thoughts in response.
That's good input. I think, yeah, John.
Well, it sounds to me like what you're talking about is the redistribution of funds from higher expensive and more expensive homes to less expensive homes. So it's an effort to redistribute income downward, basically, to less expensive, more affordable homes. And the reason why it appears popular is that it doesn't really redistribute money from people who already are here and already have homes, but it's an attempt to redistribute income from people who want to build here. And it's going to make housing more expensive for them. And that's essentially a redistributive tax. Am I right?
Yeah, I think that's a fair description of it. Yeah. And again, you still have a lot of leeway in how you apply it. But yeah, I think that's a fair description.
Okay.
Yeah, there would be an added cost to some type of development wherever, we don't exempt from, or if we did go forward with a strategy, whatever is not exempted from the CET would, have an added cost. So, and I think there are reasonable concerns that is a barrier of some sorts, but again, we do have some flexibility to define, how it applies. But I guess hearing more concerns than support so far, are there other comments than that folks have on this? Rosalie.
Well, if everyone's wondering where the money's going to come from, you got to get it somewhere. And what better way than this, I think, because there's like you said, there's lots of ways you can distribute the funds. That's one thing that I don't think we've talked about. We just talked about whether it's going to be something you're gonna propose as a tax. But I think it's really important to know where that money goes. I really like looking at how the other cities have implemented it. I like what they did. I think one city, Eugene or somewhere, I mean, the tax didn't last forever. It was what, 5 years or something? And maybe that's all is needed to get over this hump of where you need money to help the people who need the housing. The people who are being taxed don't necessarily, it seems to me like that's just a little blip for them. Maybe not, but it's like money is no object if they're gonna build a mansion in Lake Oswego. Anyway.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about what the threshold could be here in this city, where you could still actually get revenue. You know, the threshold could be quite high, like 750 or something, you know, and you'd still end up with you know, most projects having to pay the CET, at least residential. So but yeah, I appreciate your input, Rosalie. Thank you. Yeah, anybody else, you know, I guess I don't want to pick on folks, but you know, this is kind of the time that we have to talk about this. Bruce, I know we haven't seen you at a bunch of these, but you know, I guess my understanding is that you have some construction experience, and I'm just wondering how you feel about this.
The situation is every area I work in geographically has different problems. So like I've worked on several projects in Gresham, projects in Portland, presently in Hillsborough, and they're all over the board with all kinds of problems. Basically, aside from money, the other problems exist with cooperation of the various building departments in cities like Portland and what have you, getting inspections and all done on a timely basis and all just everything, you name it. We've got it going. So piece by piece, we need to look at everything and how we can make things work efficiently so that things don't go out of kilter with costs.
So you'd be concerned about adding costs to development basically through a tax like this?
Yeah, but here again, let's take a look at, every element of the cost of a project, because the tax might not be as big a burden as you think if everything else is being controlled. It's really interesting. Every area has different costs for projects. You can have the same builder, same set of plans, but it's going to cost differently depending on where you're building it at. If that makes any sense.
Of course, yeah, no, it definitely makes sense.
Well, I'm curious where you build currently that has a streamlined process that you think doesn't have impediments to effective low-cost building.
Everything has impediments.
Okay.
Everything has impediments.
All right. Go ahead. Any other thoughts on this, Rosalie?
What's an impediment? What kind of impediments are you talking about, Bruce?
It could be a situation where everything is going on time, except you turn around and you request your building inspections as you're going along, and for some reason or other, there are delays in getting those inspections done, which then creates a problem the whole way down the line.
Right.
That could be one situation. There could be a situation where the submittal of plans and getting the plans reviewed and approved, something goes wrong there. You have costs that rack up daily. Like I said, you name it, it could be a problem.
Understandable.
Yeah, Kate, I agree with what you just proposed in the chat, by the way. Sorry, I just wanted to talk about this. I think we're having a hard time reading folks' response here, and we don't know exactly if folks are leaning for or against this. So we're wondering if maybe we could do a quick like straw poll, like thumbs up, thumbs down type thing, if that makes sense. And maybe you could stop sharing the screen, Kate.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Maybe I wasn't clear enough. I would lean away from this one compared to our other options on the table at this point. Again, certainly it's hard without a lot more detail and what kind of ways we could tackle this that we're in a bit less, punitive to construction outside of the affordable zone. But as it is right now, and given the scope of other options we have, this would not be a priority for me.
Eric, I like the idea we could raise hands maybe for, support or whatnot. And I think that for just to kind of, I guess, follow up to Casey's comments, to me, this is again just about recommending exploring things, right? I mean, we're not actually implementing anything. We're really making a recommendation to council to explore, planning commission and council to explore this. And I think that, again, you have to have money in order to actually, implement some of the things that we're aiming to do. So I think it's worth having, staff and planning commission and council probably just investigate this further to see what sort of impact it may have on achieving their goals while hopefully not impacting development. So.
Well, yeah, I think maybe if folks are comfortable, there are sort of different responses that you can make, but I think maybe we should just do the raise hand. So I guess unless there's any other points, I suppose that folks would like to make before we do a straw poll, I would say if you support this concept or this strategy being included in our recommendations, to raise your hand using the sort of and maybe you don't, maybe you have a cell phone and that's going to be hard for you.
I wanted to ask one other question real quick.
Sure.
Okay, you're saying that money is needed, that you need funding for certain things. How else were you going to get money to?
There are other strategies that maybe aren't going to create their own revenue sources, but public-private partnerships are something you can leverage other resources, I suppose. But this is one of the only strategies that we have included right now that is actually going to create a new revenue source. So this is kind of the last thing that we're discussing that's on the table that would result in actual new source of money for the city to spend on housing.
And other cities have done it and it hasn't created chaos, or has it?
I'll ask the consultants for their opinion on that.
That is not what we have heard. We don't have evidence to show that it's created chaos in other places. The other thing I would just note is just that, yeah, you're right. The only other sort of revenue generation, and it's sort of partial revenue generation strategy here, is tax increment financing, but that only really raises money in a specific area, not sort of across the city. And so any other, to the extent any of these other strategies require the city to actually put money out there, they would have to pull money they would have to reduce spending in other ways to come up with that money. I mean, there's not really a lot of other ways to do it. You either shift money from other functions that the city takes care of. There are, in terms of, again, the things where the city would actually be putting money into the equation. So
maybe we could have a giant GoFundMe.
Or that, maybe a really big bake sale or flea market.
Really big bits.
Matt, does you think it makes sense just to clarify kind of like maybe an example or two for folks of what that might be? Some examples of the city because often it's the developers
Sure.
who are putting up the money. So
Well, so when we looked at that slide that talked about how the money needs to be spent. So 50% of it goes to incentives, which is reducing SDCs, for example. If you're going to reduce SDCs for certain types of developments, this kind of funding mechanism helps you backfill that. If you're going to purchase land, for instance, for an affordable housing development, that's another place this money could go. If you're going to just, financially support an organization or help subsidize the cost of their development because they're building housing for certain households making below a certain amount of money, that's another way, this money could be used. So those are the types of things. And again, if you don't have a source of funding like this, then you have to pull it from somewhere else if you want to do those things. So yeah, does that help? Does that answer the question? Yeah, cool. Okay.
Yeah, and it's just a bit of background. When we first presented this to council, they did not support it, but we did hear some interest from the planning commission. So just for context, I think we really just wanted to revisit this because of that trade-off discussion that this kind of unlocks the city's capability of looking at these other strategies, these contingent strategies, and just kind of putting this into a little bit more relief considering where we're at in the conversations.
And what I'm curious, was council's pushback on this due to the concerns that have been previously mentioned, or do you know what the issue raised?
Yeah, I think there was a reticence to impose an additional tax. Technically there is an existing CET within the city that goes towards the Lake Oswego School District. So, it's called a CET. I think other cities might call it something different, but I think there was, a reticence to introduce a new tax on development. I can do my best at sort of trying to summarize that discussion, but ultimately there wasn't much support for it. But if this task force is saying, hey, this is a source of money and we think we need a source of money, that would be good to bring to them just for their consideration, right?
I would also add just to the city council discussion that they didn't have all the information that you all have now about that, like the examples from other cities, the potential revenue generation based on past permit data, and kind of the potential ways of tailoring a CET, exempting certain types of development. We didn't really get into that deep level of detail at the time that we discussed this and kind of got initial input from city council. So it's important to maybe keep that in mind.
And Eric, if we impose this, would this cannibalize from the school district at all?
No, this wouldn't be. This would be additive. Yeah. And that's a 1% tax currently that goes towards the school district. All right, I think we're spending more time on this question, but I think that's right. I think we should be. Is there anything else that folks wanted to ask or clarify before we do the official straw poll? John.
Well, it seems to me like for me anyway, there always needs to be a question. Is there a compelling reason to do something that would cause a significant alteration in the direction of housing in our community? Would this do that? Or is it just, are we just creating another revenue stream that may or may not really impact the issue of affordability, other than making it more expensive to build more expensive homes? And I am not convinced at this point, given the information I've gotten, that this would be a compelling move in the direction we want to go. So I would vote no.
Appreciate your input, John.
Yeah, and I would suggest we move forward with this straw poll and to see what y'all think.
Yeah,
really, I mean, we know what some of you think. Let's just kind of do the show of hands. I think hands up if you would support this, and if you don't support it, no hand up, and then we'll at least know, so.
And this is for support, right?
This is for support. Yeah. So it looks like we have about 11 task force attendees right now. Are you raising your hand for us, Phil? Or are you okay? All right. So I think we have actually more like 8.
I lost my other button. Sorry about that.
No, I appreciate it, the clarification. So, but yeah, no, I think there is 2/3 or more support, it seems like, of the task force members here. So that's helpful. No, thank you, everyone. Probably, unless you have a question, might be a good time to lower your hand. But thank you so much for providing the input.
And I would just note, we are going to relay all the comments that we heard on this, including the concerns about it. We'll relay what we heard from folks, yay or nay, and then what the concerns were and what the comments were kind of for folks who said, yes, I support this. So.
Rosalie, did you? Yeah.
Yeah, man, you gotta try some things. I mean, this doesn't have to be a permanent pox on humanity or whatever. You need money. You gotta, I mean, as long as this money is put where it's most needed and does the most good, what else can you do? I mean, I talk like this, of course, because I don't have to pay the tax. I think it would help so many people, and I don't know. That's all I have to say.
Thanks, Rosalie. And yeah, I guess that's just another reminder, if you have any other comments that maybe you think of after this discussion or you want to submit in writing, we very much encourage you to do that. And yeah, so anything that you may not have thought to mention during this conversation that you'd want to bring up, be great. I guess
right.
Otherwise, I think we can move on.
Yeah, I'm going to share my screen again. So we have 2 tax abatement programs to consider here. So we have the vertical housing development zone and the multiple unit property tax exemption. So these are both tax abatements that would support primarily market rate development, so less for affordable housing, although both abatements have the opportunity to support affordable housing. So the vertical housing development zone abatement supports mixed use vertical housing, so housing above businesses on the ground floor, and it's a sort of a limited abatement for up to 10 years, or a limited property tax exemption for up to 10 years. But there's an additional exemption opportunity if there are affordable units included in the project, but it's not a requirement to have affordable units in a project. And this would, the city would designate certain areas for where this would apply. And then the MUPD program is really a quite flexible program where you could include affordability requirements or criteria as part of the program, or you could include things like the units have to be, or a certain number of the units have to meet higher accessibility standards than would otherwise be required, or they need to provide a certain number of bedrooms or that kind of thing. So that one in particular could be tailored based on sort of the biggest needs in the community. And so there's a lot of different ways that one could go. So, and then in terms of magnitude, just to remind folks, the MUPD, we gave that sort of a moderate level in terms of impact. And then the vertical housing, low to moderate. And I think in particular, this one is a more complicated project, or a more complicated program to implement. And I think folks have heard from both applicants and from city staff that are administrating this program that it's a little bit more challenging than some of the other tax abatement programs. So maybe looking at these 2 together, does anyone have any thoughts or comments or questions?
I think maybe we should remind folks of the other tax abatements that we are recommending as well, in the recommended strategies too, just as the larger kind of context here.
Yeah, so this was our kind of big comparison table. So the 2 that are included in the recommendations are the nonprofit low-income housing abatement and the low-income rental housing abatement. And these are kind of similar. They're sort of overlapping, but they have slightly different kind of criteria and applicability. And I think the recommendation here would be for the city to adopt both of them, ideally, or it could adopt one or the other. But an applicant could sort of choose which program kind of best fit their needs and their project.
John.
I do have a question. Why wouldn't we include for a tax abatement program some kind of affordability requirements?
I will play devil's advocate as I answer your question, John. I think what we're recommending is that we are going to require that either through a nonprofit or other means. And these are the ones that we're talking about, where you'd be promoting essentially other types of housing that are needed by the city that aren't quote unquote affordable. So there would be, the exemptions would be used towards, market rate units, and particularly for vertical housing and the MUFD, but there would be, a certain form of development that we might want to promote, such as, those sort of multifamily developments for the MUFD, or, multifamily developments with commercial ground floor for the vertical housing. That's essentially the biggest difference. So yeah, there's some benefits to those types of housing, but I think, specifically a lot of the needs in terms of where I think the city can make the biggest difference is to help out with that sort of lower end of the market. So that's where we're recommending that the exemptions be focused. But yeah, I think just the devil's advocate is we need those types of housing too, but there's certainly a justification to just focusing on affordable.
Okay.
And I think another thing that I thought was interesting is that we were concerned, in particular with the MUFD, that maybe it could outcompete some of the other tax abatement programs, so that if we were to adopt both of them, then maybe developers would find the MUFD more desirable than some of the more low-income focused ones. So I think that's another consideration here as to, maybe, if we were to adopt that, it might have some impacts on those nonprofit or low-income oriented tax abatements. So, yeah, I suppose, it's not quite as straightforward. It's just like, if I don't hear anything, I assume that you're in support. But, is there anything that, are there any concerns or anybody have anything to say about the sort of two exemptions that we're talking about here on the right side of the screen? Casey, go ahead.
I just had a question. Maybe you mentioned that there were concerns thrown out, particularly around the vertical housing. Do you maybe want to give a rundown of kind of what have been the expressed concerns so far?
Yeah, essentially, how all of these work are, you essentially notify the taxing districts that you're proposing this tax abatement program, and then those taxing districts. So these range from Clackamas County, different levels of Clackamas County, including, Educational Service District of Clackamas County, or, other, the Port of Portland takes out some of the taxes and gets a percentage of the taxes, and school districts. So there's a lot of different districts that are impacted by this potentially. And so we notify them that they, of this potential abatement, and then they have the opportunity to opt out. So it's kind of baked into all these programs that, we're not forcing taxing districts to, apply or to sacrifice their taxes to forego those that tax revenue. But, they didn't necessarily express concerns about the specific proposal for the North Anchor project for the vertical housing development zone. But I think in general, there was concern about tax abatements that would take money from the school district and provide it for market rate housing. I think that's somewhat, I think Joe might know a little bit more about this. He was more involved with those discussions, but yeah, I think there was a concern about loss of revenue, specifically to maybe promote the development of a type of housing that, maybe I think they wanted a little bit more of a guarantee of affordability, or that it would be constructed, to provide access for certain folks that need it more.
Well, and the other thing is that you may lose money from your property tax revenue, but you may gain money by having more students because you have more affordable housing that will encourage families. And so the trade-off
Yes.
may be worth it for the school district.
Yes, and that's, yeah,
Mhm.
obviously, if we're going to propose this to anybody, we will do that analysis and present, kind of the potential gain in revenue as well. I think that's a very good point, John. Thanks. But we did hear concerns, I guess, is kind of the takeaway from Clackamas County and the school district in particular. I think, when maybe if you're operating at Clackamas County's level, and you hear that, you're promoting, tax payment for market rate development in Lake Oswego, it plays a certain way, I guess, to the rest of the county, and maybe, it would make more sense to promote affordable housing from their perspective. Rosalie.
Oh, yeah, I don't really think that market rate development needs a tax exemption. I know you're saying that it could promote more development, but why don't we promote more development that's affordable? Anyway, that's it.
I appreciate your comment, Rosalie. I think, is there anybody that kind of disagrees with Rosalie or has a different take on this? I think that might be kind of my general sense of the sort of mood here overall. All right. Well, I guess speak now or forever hold your peace on the vertical housing development zone, or MUFTI. Again, knowing that we are recommending 2 other tax abatements for specifically affordable housing.
I guess my last question would be for the MUFTI in particular, if it were structured to specifically incentivize, say, accessible housing, and that's actually one of the recommended strategies for the city to consider, either requiring more accessible units in a development or providing some kind of incentives to encourage more accessible units. So MUFTI would actually be one of the potential incentive approaches to that strategy. So there's some overlap here that you could consider. So, I mean, would folks be more open to considering that one? Even if it's market rate housing, you could tailor it to meet a certain housing need that is still, identified as kind of a gap in the supply.
Would it need to be a
Yes.
multi-unit housing, accessible housing complex?
It would still need to be some type of multi-unit, but it could be middle housing or, multifamily.
The answer is yes, I would.
You would support that?
Yes.
Are these hands for supporting?
Rosalie, yeah.
No.
Go ahead.
I was just
Draw
gonna
full
say.
hand.
Oh, no, hello? I was just gonna say that, I think that those requirements should be there anyway without having to get a tax exemption.
I was gonna say the same thing. Like, I guess I was wondering again, like, I mean, aren't there already like fair housing, I guess, rules? Maybe they don't apply.
There are requirements for
Yeah.
accessible housing through fair housing or through the building code. But I think what Kate is alluding to is, could there be a tax exemption to go above and beyond the minimum? And I kind of like that idea, and the reason being is whenever you build accessible units, of course they're bigger, they require more equipment, and then in order to build them efficiently, you essentially have to build them one on top of another in order for everything to kind of line up and your plumbing and everything to work. So I wouldn't personally necessarily support a MUFTI in and of itself, but maybe to do something like that, I would.
I don't know, again, coming from a affordable housing developer, like we are always required to have a certain percentage of affordable, like of accessible units, ADA, just different communications units. And I mean, the way that we've done it, like our standard unit can be, I mean, it's universally designed so that like it's very easy to swap in and out the components that would make it ADA, like lower counter heights. But I mean, these are basic things like designing so that a wheelchair has space to turn around in any unit. Like some of these things I feel like should be in there anyway.
Required. Yeah.
So
No, I think that's
yeah. For me, I don't feel like
real
that.
quick. Kitchens and bathrooms do have to be
Right.
but you're right. Certain other components, it's more of a matter of height, but bathrooms and kitchens are, you know, the more expensive part of a unit to build. So that's just my thought.
Well, John, I want you to go forward with your comment. I do have a potential recommendation for how we can incorporate this, but I just want to hear from you first.
Oh no, I should have lowered the hand.
Oh, I see. I see. Well, I guess my proposal would be we could at least maybe as part of the recommendation related to potentially, you know, incentivizing or requiring accessibility in new housing, include this as one potential mechanism to provide an incentive for accessible housing, but not to necessarily move forward with MUPD as a quote unquote housing production strategy outside of that accessible framework. Are folks okay with that?
Yeah.
I don't think we want to limit ourselves to any tool in particular when it comes to the accessible conversation, so I might as well include it in the conversation, I suppose. All right, so if that sounds good to folks, I feel comfortable here. Kate, how do you feel?
I like that solution. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Great. Matt agrees. All right. Well, maybe we'll talk about, I think there's just one more strategy to really talk about, which is pre-approved plan sets for middle housing. So we are already recommending pre-approved plan sets for accessory dwelling units. That's a little bit more of a straightforward type of housing that to create pre-approved plan sets for. They're smaller units. You can have a detached unit that could be kind of a standardized design that could fit on a lot of properties. Big middle housing is a little bit more challenging because, you know, Lake Oswego has a lot of topography. It might not be as straightforward to develop, say, a duplex design that would fit on a lot of lots in the city. But we have heard from folks involved in building middle housing that this would be that these would be used, and it would encourage, you know, more development of middle housing, in particular, maybe, excuse me, maybe convincing some folks that are currently only building, you know, larger single family homes to consider building middle housing, and so getting you know, kind of more housing units out of an existing lot than is currently being built, and just kind of facilitating that process, streamlining the review, reducing costs, et cetera. But I think just because again, middle housing is a little bit more challenging than accessory dwelling units, we hadn't initially recommended this necessarily. We just wanted to have a little bit more discussion with you all to see if you think this is worth including in the recommended strategies. Go ahead, Sarah.
Yes, I'm wondering, like, has there been any discussion, and again, I missed last meeting, but was there any discussion just about like a way to streamline the processing of middle housing other than having these kind of pre-approved plans? Because my thought is, again, just like you were saying, it's going to be, I think, very challenging to have a pre-approved, you know, set that you can just kind of plop down onto, you know, a lot. I think that's going to be, I mean, it might work in some instances, but my guess is, you know, with locating utilities and trees and all these different, you know, streets, parking, all these different factors, that it's going to be challenging to actually develop, you know, a couple sets of typologies. I think it's also going to cost more money than I think an ADU type set of plans would, because it's more units. But I'm just wondering if there was any discussion about trying to maybe figure out ways to streamline the processing of this just on its own without, without having a typology approved.
Yeah, I think, Sarah, this might be another idea that kind of could be within the umbrella of the code audit and amendment strategy, that first one, where that is part of what, I'm not sure exactly how we've worded it within this document, but that is what the staff understands that project will involve a look at the processes as well, not just, the actual code requirements in terms of this, dimensional and, design standards and things like that. So I think we are definitely planning to take a deeper look at that and can be a little bit more specific about that in the language, and specifically, point out middle housing as something that we will look into the processing and, permit fees and such for as barriers.
Is it, what is the approving body typically for middle housing right now? Is it staff?
It depends, but yes,
Okay.
staff. I mean, it depends on if there's a middle housing land division, then that is technically a minor development decision. So that's a little bit different. We have seen at least one of those, I think, at least potential. So yes, but for the most part, it's as of right.
Okay, because if it's happening at a staff level, then I mean that's pretty good. I would think that just like looking at again, looking at constraints that could be looked at in the code to streamline the approval of these types of housing, and setting up maybe some sort of like, again, I don't know how big staff is, but I know some cities are setting up like a liaison that maybe handles like affordable housing cases and like middle housing, so that they're kind of specialized in processing these types of projects and have that knowledge. That may be you anyway, Eric. I don't know, but
I don't review plans, but yeah, I think that's certainly the type of thing that we can talk about with that exercise. I can't. I'm not sure that would be within like the stuff that outlines processes in the code necessarily, but there's still other things procedurally that we could do as a city, I suppose.
And I would just note that, that was sort of one of the big impacts of the middle housing legislation in Oregon, was to say cities need to, of a certain size and in the metro area, need to allow these types of housing in a lot more residential zones than you previously had been, and do that as an outright permitted use, essentially not require people to go through like a conditional use permitting process or something like that. So that's, from a code perspective, it's changed a lot, just in the last few years. As a result of that. So it doesn't mean that everything is being done to streamline it, but it did make a difference, I'd say.
Just from a staff perspective, there is more that we can do to streamline the process specifically for middle housing land divisions, I think. So there are, improvements that we could make, absolutely.
I think, Eric, if you're able to kind of as staff even, provide like a couple ideas like to, as part of this, I think that would be great. So that would be my thought, is instead of going with pre-approved plan sets, looking at ways to just streamline and incentivize and kind of update the code to make sure that it's per kind of what staff is seeing to improve that.
Okay. John.
Yeah, am I right in assuming that I'm looking at the magnitude of impact, but am I right in assuming that builders or developers might go through this process but still price these units at market rates?
That is right. There would be, I mean, unless there was a specific orientation towards ensuring that these are affordable in some capacity, or like the design really prioritize that in certain capacity, that is the concept. The concept is not to specifically mandate affordability of these units, but to fulfill the needs with respect to middle housing. So it would be market rate for the most part.
Now, is this use? I mean, I noticed that in Portland, in some neighborhoods, there are a lot of houses that look exactly alike. They're spread all over the neighborhoods. They infill these houses. Is that an example of what we're talking about here, where there's a set of plans that seems to be used over and over and over again throughout neighborhoods?
I think there's some folks that point out that that happens even in Lake Oswego. Yes. I'm not sure if that's the specific policy that led to the outcome that you're describing, but it is a potential outcome.
And do we know if it's ever, this whole idea has ever been used successfully, and do we know how?
I can try to respond to that. So I think, John, what you're pointing out is something that developers already do, which is they find it as kind of a template plan that works for them, and they kind of replicate it across the city. You know, they acquire new properties and kind of build a similar type of style of house. So that's just something that the market is already doing, and probably didn't result from specific policy from the city. City of Portland did attempt to provide some resources that would kind of achieve something similar to pre-approved plan sets. I don't think they got as far as actually getting like the building department to approve like specific plan sets, but they did provide some kind of design templates. But that program seemed to be phased out several years ago, so it's not currently effective anymore. I'm not aware of any cities that, at least in Oregon, that have done this specifically for middle housing. I know at least one city has done this for accessory dwelling units. City of Eugene has that program for ADUs. But yeah, I think just because it's a little more challenging for middle housing, that hasn't happened yet. But there are definitely cities that are considering it.
Yeah, I guess if I were a developer just getting started, or a developer looking to maximize my earnings, if I had reduced fees because I was using a plan that I'd already used or that's been approved by the city, I wouldn't necessarily feel like I had to pass on that savings to the buyers of that property.
Yeah. I mean, I think one thing the city could maybe do if it wanted to go this route is to develop plan sets for kind of smaller housing units. So at least, designing homes that couldn't be too expensive, because, folks wouldn't pay that much for a very small unit, or say like a small cottage development with small cottage units. That's one example that could at least provide more attainable housing options, but not necessarily reducing costs just because there's kind of pre-designed units. And just to point out that Thea put in the chat that we haven't seen any pre-approved plan sets yet for middle housing, but there's significant interest. Thank you, Thea.
Yeah, I guess I might support this if the pre-approved plans were modest in scope. I would be loath to accept it if pre-approved plans are for $1.5 million, $2 million homes being built.
Yeah, no, that's a very reasonable point. There are things that you can do with the design, obviously, to try to encourage, materials that are, high quality but more affordable, or something that would lend itself to a high quality design. Yeah, I think it's, as you pointed out, it's hard to guarantee that those savings will be passed down to whoever ends up with the unit ultimately. And I guess I'm wondering, it seems like we probably, I guess this is a question for Kate and Matt, but would we have the ability to add additional conditions, I guess, to this that would encourage affordability? Or obviously that's kind of, that might reduce the viability of this significantly. But is that something that you've explored or thought about at all?
Yeah, I feel like it's come up in discussions in other communities. I don't know how effective it would be, particularly in Lake Oswego, where you could do a design that doesn't have any limitations, and you could sell it for whatever price you wanted to. I don't know, Brendan, if you have any thoughts about how that might be able to work in Lake Oswego.
I haven't heard about that. I guess your choices would be to have pre-approved plans that you that you can only use for the housing that has an affordability component, or
I'm not sure exactly what it would look like. I guess, some type of condition related to that. Again, it's I'm wondering if this is just kind of baked into the strategy, that it is kind of a market rate strategy, or if there's anything that we can do.
I think so. I think the idea behind these is similar to ADU, where you're promoting housing production in general, and in the theory that additional supply is going to help over time meet take some of the stress off the housing supply and housing market. So that's always been my understanding of the idea of having the pre-approved plans. But it's an interesting idea. Yeah, if we could integrate an affordability component with it somehow, it might take some more thinking.
All right, John, did you have any more comments? There's a couple other folks with their hands raised. I guess I'll move on, to Joe.
Thanks, Eric. I was just gonna, back up what Brendan said. We had talked about this previously, and really noticing that we're not getting a lot of middle housing applications in. And when we first implemented the middle housing code, thinking like, well, how could we signal, as a community that we're really interested in these various housing types to the development community? So we talked about the last meeting, the code here is very complicated, neighborhood by neighborhood, it differs. And so we see lots of the same folks building, and they have their kind of they have their pro forma, if you will, right? And so, well, it may not be like what this is. They have their way of coming in, as John pointed out, and building. They have the footprint, done. So we see the same thing because they've got that down. But that providing something like this could signal to the development community, people who don't currently build in Lake Oswego, but who build middle housing or are more geared towards that type of product, that we want to help provide a blueprint, knowing that there's a little bit of a hump to get over in terms of our development code and the intricacies of Lake Oswego's code, just to help get over that hump and encourage more of this particular housing type. But we saw it. I think we've been thinking of it more as a market rate type strategy to encourage the variety of housing types, more so than a affordable housing type thing.
Thanks for all of that, Joe. I think certainly really important to point out that, I guess just to piggyback on what you were saying and echo what Kate was saying before, that there is interest from the development community in this type of thing, and that could promote a little bit more of this within the city, and we aren't really seeing much of it so far. Rosalie?
I really like the idea of the pre-approved plans for ADUs, at least. I don't know about the middle housing part, the duplexes and triplexes and stuff, or cottage things. But I do like it for ADUs. And I think that if a developer or a homeowner who wanted to put an ADU in their backyard or whatever, wanted to use one of those plan sets, I think that it should be saving them money, right? By using something that's already pre-approved and right there,
yes,
and ready to go. So I think that they get the opportunity to use those, they should reflect that in, if they're going to rent the place, that it should be more affordable. I think that should be a requirement. And they shouldn't be able to use it for an Airbnb. I don't think.
I think we would probably recommend a condition like that at a minimum.
And in regards to more housing, equates to somehow it's going to trickle down into more affordability for people. Well, how could that be if there's if y'all keep saying that there's not enough land to build? You just got to take what you have and somehow make it affordable, what you have. And this might be one of the ways to do it with the ADUs. Anyway, if that makes sense, I don't know.
Oh, definitely. I appreciate your comments. I will say I'm not getting clear direction necessarily on this from folks. I think to summarize what I'm hearing, it sounds like to the extent that folks support this strategy, they support it such that it could support, well, I guess that maybe that's not the best way to say it, but folks either support the strategy for the development of specifically middle housing or would only support it if there were some type of affordability requirement attached. It seems like there's kind of two lines of thinking, I guess, that are out there right now. And I guess, yeah, I think that's a good point. We're, I guess, in terms of the pre-approved ADU plan sets, that even, that is pretty new territory. And I'm not sure, I guess we'd probably be the first jurisdiction to take something like this on if we were to do that. Is that accurate, Kate? Yeah.
I mean, yeah, based on what Thea said, no one has implemented this yet, but a lot of other jurisdictions are considering it, so they might beat you to it, but
right.
Yeah.
Fairly new territory, but yeah, I think certainly, I guess we'll point out that it's probably, I think it would probably be most effective as a market rate strategy in terms of like actually, the viability, would be, I think it would take on a little bit better, most likely based on, the input I'm getting. Maybe we should do another straw poll on this one. Yeah. So, well, yeah, let's just go ahead and do another straw poll on this one because there isn't a clear consensus, I suppose. Do you want to stop sharing the screen? Any other questions or yeah?
Oh.
Bill?
No, that was the.
Oh, okay. You're trying to vote. So yeah, I guess raise your hand or either via Zoom or in real life to let us know whether or not you support this strategy. If you support it, raise your hand. All right, so we got 7 again, at least. So yeah, I think majority support here. And is there any like caveats, I suppose, that folks want to include, or it seems like there's a comfort with this as a more market rate oriented approach? Is that, is there anything else that we want to sort of clarify with this? John, Rosalie, I don't know if you have your hand up still, John, or if you want to say something. Oh, Rosalie?
Yeah, I hate the words market rate, coming from a person who has the market rate flown into my face too many times, to count. That's a long story, but, I just think that if you're going to have this option, it should be directed more to affordability rather than market rate. I'm speaking mainly about ADUs. The other stuff is a little bit different for me. I mean, that's.
Yeah, if I can just add, I think for me, this is a lower priority item than some of the other ones. And kind of for that same reason that I think that it seems like market rate townhomes, there's still that type of development is occurring. Like we see infill development happening in the city on small lots, 2 houses going in on a where one house was type deal. And I understand middle housing is maybe a little bit different than that, but it seems to me like this would be one that could maybe lag or is maybe just a little bit lower priority than some of the other ones that are on there. But it doesn't mean it's not worth exploring.
Yeah.
Thanks, Sarah. Matt, do you want to add anything before we go to Phil?
Yeah, just I thought get that, because we haven't talked about relative priority of some of these in this set of strategies. And I think that's a good point. I think it's probably reflects some of what we've already heard. So.
Phil, Phil.
So yeah, so the reason I didn't support this one was I liked one of the earlier comments that was made where I thought we can do a better job of assisting this item through maybe streamlining its review through review of the building code and plan check. And then the other thing is you know, as a designer, I'm having a hard time visualizing how this would even be possible given our you know, things we're talking about, topography and trees and lakes and rivers, etc. I think the only way we could really come up with a pre-approved document would be just a series of components. So like you have a 0 lot line unit that you pre-approve, and then you can build it into a duplex or a triplex or a quadplex, or you have a pre-approved corridor served apartment unit that you can then build into a building to fit a site. Otherwise, I'm not sure how you create something for Lake Oswego, and it may be the fact that nobody else has adopted this in Oregon yet, even in cities where the land is flatter, you know, may be telling us something. So, but in the end, you know, as you all know, I'm a planning commissioner, so ultimately I will ultimately support what what our citizens think is best and bring to us. But this is just sort of my personal take on it.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, you know, I think that's a good suggestion, that sort of modularity component and what that could look like and how that could provide more flexibility for challenging, you know, development constraints or topography or whatnot. So that might be a cool thing to explore without taking away flexibility for designers to do their thing, I suppose. Yeah, you know, I think generally, you know, I guess I'm thinking that maybe we could include these as considerations. So the affordability consideration is certainly something that, you know, we can try to incorporate as an overlay if we were gonna, you know, take this on as a city. And also the idea of potentially looking at more modular types of units and not necessarily you know, everything permitted all ready to go. I guess there might be other sort of plug and play ways to think of this. So are folks comfortable, though, I guess, including this as a lower priority recommendation with some of those considerations added? I guess we already did the straw poll here, but I guess what I'm saying is we will incorporate your considerations into our recommendation unless we hear otherwise. All right, well, I really appreciate all of the comments and everything that you've added here. I think we made our way through the strategies the required further discussion here. So I think we did it. I mean, we're not done, but we've gotten through a really big milestone here. So congratulations, everyone.
So I think the last thing, Eric, was if we have time to just kind of recap the discussion today. I don't know if you want to do that. I've been taking notes, so I could do a first attempt.
Yes, that might, I can add and yeah, complement as needed.
Okay. So in terms of the recommended strategies, I think we're forwarding all those that we'd already identified as recommended. We are going to make the changes that you all suggested at the last meeting in terms of moving the priority of a couple of those, or the implementation timeline of a couple of those strategies. And then in terms of the strategies needing further discussion, it sounds like for zoning incentives, we will be, actually, we didn't have kind of a clear direction on that one, but I think in the code audit and updates or amendment strategy, we would incorporate a recommendation to include the Senate Bill 8 affordability and density height bonus requirements into the development code. And then maybe using that code audit and amendment strategy to look at potential development code barriers or things that constrain affordable housing development and trying to address those. So I think that's what I heard, maybe not identifying that as a separate strategy, but it just, again, incorporating that into code update.
I think that's what I heard, and also just kind of explore some alternatives to just height and density as incentives. So lot coverage or things like that, setbacks.
Yeah, and also, I don't know if we need to include this in the HPS, but acknowledging that there could be state legislation that requires the city to allow a certain number of adjustments or variances to things like setbacks and lot coverage.
Yeah, I guess considering that there wasn't, I guess maybe we weren't super clear on that at that time. I guess maybe we should just pause here. Does that sound right to everybody? Are folks concerned about the way we're characterizing that, or does that seem like we're on track?
Yes.
All right.
So,
I think
that was my intention with what I had suggested. Sounds good.
Awesome. All right. Unpause.
Great. For construction excise tax, we did take a straw poll on that one. 8 out of 11 of the folks here gave a thumbs up. So we will be including that in the recommendations. But, sharing some of the concerns and, some of the discussion that we had today, sharing that with the Planning Commission and City Council. Let's see, we are not recommending vertical housing development zone tax abatement. And then for the multiple unit property tax exemption, or MUPD, we would include that as one of the potential mechanisms for incentivizing or encouraging accessibility. So as part of the accessible unit strategy. So not having that as a standalone strategy. And then for pre-approved plan sets, we will be including those recommendations, but or including those in the recommendations, but add some of the ideas that we talked about in terms of requiring some amount of accessibility, or affordability, and maybe considering some type of modular approach in the considerations for that strategy. So to sum up, we would be including 2 of the 5.
Oh, yeah, one would be folded into another strategy.
2 of the 5 would be recommended standalone strategies, so CET and pre-approved plan sets for middle housing. And then 2 of the other ones would be kind of included into other recommended strategies. So there we have it. Any last concerns about any of that?
Yeah, this is definitely a good time to address those if folks have any questions they want to talk about. Of course, I will remind folks we do have another meeting that we're going to use to essentially present to you all the draft HPS document based on what we're talking about with you all right now and based on what we hear from council and the Planning Commission. So there will be another sort of bite at the apple in that respect. But yeah, I'm glad that we've gotten to this point. And please, don't hesitate to reach out to me if you have any questions or concerns, or if there's anything you want to talk about in more detail.
Let's see.
Matt is paused for me.
That's funny. Matt, you were paused with a thumbs up for a minute there.
Yeah.
Perfect. I just said great job. This was a great meeting from my perspective, and I just appreciate everybody's thoughtful discussion and good work, and thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, great discussion, everyone.
I was just going to share our next steps slide, especially to call out the community forum coming up in a couple weeks. Eric, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so there will be a community forum on the housing production strategy work on March 14th. That will be held virtually. We also are planning to have some interactive engagement tool, likely like a survey type document available at the same time for folks to respond to. So we will be soliciting that through all the boards and commissions, and we'll include the task force and all that as well. So after that outreach, we're planning to take these recommendations to City Council and the Planning Commission at a joint work session on April 2nd and get some more detailed feedback now that we're a little bit further along in the process. Yeah, our next step after that will be to incorporate that feedback in the draft housing production strategy document. So that's what will be basically the focus of our next meeting, and we're tentatively targeting June 21st for that one. So yeah, that lot going on here. We're really kind of in some of the most consequential decisions of this project. So it's really it has a lot of momentum, and I really appreciate the great discussion you all had with us today. I really appreciate it, all the input. And I hope you have a good weekend. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you all.